There is a ruler in your inner world. You did not elect this ruler. You did not consciously choose its laws. And yet it sits on a throne in the depths of your being, issuing decrees that shape every reaction, every assumption, every conversation you hold with yourself when the world goes quiet. Neville Goddard called it the tyrant. Carl Jung called it the shadow. One tradition speaks of inner conversation, the other speaks of integration. But strip away the language, and you find the same confession, that there is something in you, naming you as unworthy or unsafe or unlovable, and until you confront it, until you dethrone it, you cannot be free. You cannot create. You cannot claim I am. This episode is about that confrontation. Because you clicked on a thumbnail that said, "Kill your tyrant," and I want to tell you, Neville meant it literally, not as metaphor, not as self-help. He meant the annihilation of a false authority and the restoration of the only real power you have ever had. Let's begin. Welcome to Neville Goddard Universe. This is a place for those who sense that the great mystical and esoteric traditions of the world are not separate streams, but tributaries of a single river. Neville Goddard is our anchor, the teacher who dared to say that consciousness is the only reality, that imagination creates, and that you are not a fragment of the divine, but the divine itself, wearing the costume of limitation. In this episode, we're bringing Neville's teaching on the inner tyrant into conversation with Carl Jung's concept of shadow work. These two men, working in different disciplines and different decades, both recognize the same truth, that you are never fighting the world. You are fighting a story you have been telling yourself about the world, and about your place in it. That story has a voice, it has a throne, and it rules you until you take back the crown. We'll explore what Neville actually said about this inner tyrant in his 1950s lectures. We'll see how Jungian shadow work and Neville's technique of inner conversation address the same wound. We'll walk through why changing external circumstances is impossible without first confronting the inner state that gave rise to them. And then we'll move into a step-by-step practice, how to identify your tyrant, name it, and replace it with the I am authority that was always yours. If you've been drawn to this channel because you sense there is something deeper here, something connecting Neville to the mystery schools, to depth psychology, to the mystical core of every tradition, then this episode is for you. And if this exploration resonates, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like or subscribe. It keeps this work alive, and it tells me I'm not walking this path alone. There are minds here ready for this conversation, and I honor every one of them. Let's go deeper. In a lecture given in the mid-1950s, Neville said something that most readers of his work miss entirely. He said, "You are not fighting a person. You are fighting a belief. And that belief is a tyrant." He was speaking to a room full of people who had come to him with what they thought were external problems. A difficult boss, a withholding lover, a body that refused to heal, a bank account that refused to grow. And Neville, with the directness that defined his teaching, told them the uncomfortable truth. The outer world was not their problem. Their problem was the inner conversation they were having about the outer world, and more specifically, the invisible authority they had given that conversation. Let me say that again, because it is the hinge on which this entire teaching turns. You have an inner conversation running at all times. It comments on everything. It interprets your past. It predicts your future. It tells you who you are. And if you have not consciously claimed authority over that conversation, then someone else is speaking for you. Something else. A voice that sounds like you, but is not you. A voice that has been cobbled together from old wounds, inherited beliefs, fearful projections, and the judgments of a world that never knew your true name. Neville called this voice the tyrant. It is not an entity. It is not a demon. It is a belief system that has taken on the function of a ruler. And here is the insidious part. It rules you by pretending to protect you. It says, "Don't assume you're worthy of love. You'll only be disappointed." It says, "Don't imagine success. You'll look foolish when you fail." It says, "Don't claim health, your body has always betrayed you." It wraps itself in the language of realism, of caution, of self-preservation. But what it is actually doing is preserving your limitations. It is keeping you small, not because it hates you, but because it has mistaken smallness for safety, and you have obeyed it. Not because you are weak, but because you did not know there was another option. Neville's insight, and this is where his teaching becomes genuinely radical, is that this tyrant has no power of its own. It rules only because you have not yet claimed the throne. The moment you recognize that the inner conversation is not a reflection of objective reality, but a creative act in itself, the tyrant's authority collapses. Because the tyrant is not consciousness. It is content within consciousness. And consciousness, your I am, is sovereign. Let me give you a lived example, because this cannot remain abstract. Imagine a woman who has spent her entire adult life assuming she is not the kind of person who is chosen. Not for love, not for opportunity, not for joy. She does not say this out loud, of course. She may not even say it consciously. But the belief is there, quietly structuring every interaction. When someone is kind to her, she assumes they pity her. When someone invites her somewhere, she assumes they had no better option. When she desires something, she does not move toward it with expectation. She braces for loss. Her inner conversation is a steady hum of self-diminishment. And this conversation does not merely describe her experience, it creates it. The world is yourself pushed out. If her inner tyrant says, "You are not chosen," then the world will reflect that assumption back to her in 1,000 small confirmations. Not because the world is cruel, but because the world has no choice. It is the mirror of consciousness. It must show her what she believes. Now, Neville would not tell this woman to fight harder. He would not tell her to change the outer circumstances first. He would tell her to go within, to listen to the conversation, to identify the tyrant, the voice that insists she is unchosen, and to recognize it for what it is, a belief, not a truth, and then to replace it. This is the core of Neville's method. You do not negotiate with the tyrant. You do not try to convince it you are worthy. You dethrone it. You take back the authority it stole. You claim your I am. The woman begins a new inner conversation, not as affirmation, not as hopeful wishing, but as assumption. I am chosen. I am desired. I am seen. She repeats this, not to the world, but to herself. She saturates her inner speech with it. And slowly, sometimes quickly, the outer world begins to shift, not because she forced it to, but because she changed the state from which she was perceiving it. Neville said it plainly. An assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. The tyrant's reign ends the moment you stop feeding it. Your attention, your belief, your authority. And the I am. The consciousness that is you, that was always you, steps forward to take its rightful place. Carl Jung did not use the word tyrant. He used the word shadow. But listen to what he meant by it, and you will hear the same teaching in a different key. Jung said that the shadow is the part of the psyche that contains everything we have disowned. Everything we have judged as unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. The anger we learned to suppress. The desire we learned to call selfish. The fear we were never allowed to name. These parts do not disappear when we disown them. They go underground. They take up residence in the unconscious. And from there, they rule us. They rule us by projection, by compulsion, by the very patterns we swore we would never repeat. Jung's life work was built on the conviction that you cannot be whole until you reclaim the shadow. Until you turn toward the disowned parts, name them, and integrate them back into conscious awareness. This process, shadow work, is not about indulging every dark impulse. It is about withdrawing the projections we have cast onto the world and recognizing them as inner content. It is about taking responsibility for the entirety of the psyche, not just the parts we have deemed acceptable. Now, Neville would not have used Jung's language. He was not a psychologist. He was a mystic, a teacher of scripture as psychological drama, a man who insisted that all causation is internal. But strip away the terminology, and the two men are saying the same thing. The tyrant and the shadow are two names for the same phenomenon, an inner authority that you did not consciously choose, but which governs your perception, your emotional life, and therefore your outer experience. Both Neville and Jung understood that you are not merely a passive observer of your own psyche. You are the creative principle within it. And until you claim that role, until you take conscious authority over the inner conversation, you remain subject to forces you do not recognize as your own. Here is where the convergence becomes explicit. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And Neville said, "The world you see is your inner speech made visible. Change the inner conversation and you must change the outer world." Do you see it? The same truth, the same confrontation. Both men are telling you that what you call fate, or bad luck, or external obstacle, is actually the externalizing of an unexamined inner state. Both are telling you that freedom comes not from changing the world, but from changing the lens through which you see it. And both are telling you that this is not a passive process. It is an act of conscious will, a claiming of authority. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming a whole, conscious being. Neville called it entering the state, the deliberate assumption of a new identity, a new inner conversation, a new I am. The methods differ. Jung's shadow work involves dialogue with the unconscious, active imagination, dream analysis, the careful excavation of projection. Neville's method involves assumption and imagination, the deliberate construction of a new inner narrative, and the feeling of its reality. But the goal is identical, to end the reign of the unconscious tyrant and restore conscious sovereignty. Let me bring this home with a specific Jungian concept that maps directly onto Neville's teaching. Jung spoke of the complex, an emotionally charged cluster of beliefs, memories, and associations that functions semi-autonomously in the psyche. A complex is like a sub-personality. It has its own voice, its own logic, its own agenda. And when it is activated, it can hijack your perception entirely. You stop responding to reality and start responding to the complex. Sound familiar? This is what Neville meant by the tyrant. A complex, a belief system, that has taken on the function of an inner ruler. It is not you, but it speaks as if it were. And if you do not recognize it as content within consciousness, if you mistake it for the voice of truth, then it will shape your entire experience. Neville did not speak of complexes. He spoke of states. But the principle is the same. A state is a fixed pattern of inner conversation, a habitual assumption, a lens through which you interpret everything. And you can occupy a state of lack, or a state of unworthiness, or a state of victimhood, not because these states are metaphysically true, but because you have given them authority. You have enthroned them. Jung would say, bring the complex into consciousness, dialogue with it, understand its origin, integrate it. Neville would say, recognize the state, name it, and then assume a new one. Do not negotiate with the old assumption, replace it. Both are acts of sovereignty. Both are refusals to remain subject to an inner tyrant you did not consciously choose. And here is why this matters, why the convergence between Neville and Jung is not just intellectually interesting, but existentially urgent. Because you cannot fix an external circumstance that was created by an internal state. You cannot revise the world without revising the self. If you are occupied by the tyrant, if your inner conversation is dictated by lack, fear, unworthiness, or resentment, then every action you take in the outer world will be poisoned at the root. You will sabotage your own success. You will interpret love as manipulation. You will see opportunity as threat. Not because you are broken, but because you are seeing through a lens you did not choose. This is what Neville meant when he said, the world is yourself pushed out. The outer is always the inner made visible. You are not encountering a neutral reality. You are encountering your own consciousness, reflected back at you in the language of events. So when the thumbnail said, "Kill your tyrant," this is what it meant. Not a metaphor, not a motivational slogan. A genuine act of psychological and spiritual sovereignty. The dismantling of a false authority and the reclaiming of the I am. You do this by naming the tyrant, by recognizing its voice, and by choosing, consciously and deliberately, to speak from a different place. Let's move into the practice. This is not theory. This is a practice you can begin tonight. Step 1. Observe the inner conversation. For the next few days, I want you to become aware of the voice that narrates your experience. Not the voice you use when you speak to others, but the voice you use when you speak to yourself. The commentary that runs beneath everything you do. The predictions, the judgments, the interpretations. Most of this conversation is unconscious. It happens so quickly, so habitually, that you do not even register it as a choice. But it is a choice. And the first step in reclaiming sovereignty is to notice what you have been choosing by default. So, when something happens, someone cancels plans, you receive criticism, you look in the mirror, you check your bank account. Pause. And listen to what you say to yourself about it. Not what you think you should say. Not what you would say to a friend. What you actually say, in the privacy of your own mind. This is the voice of the tyrant. It might say, "Of course they canceled. No one really wants to spend time with me." It might say, "I knew this wouldn't work. I'm not the kind of person who gets what they want." It might say, "I look old. I look tired. I am fading." Write these down, not to judge yourself, not to analyze where they came from, just to see them. To recognize them as content, not truth. Step 2. Name the tyrant. Give this voice a name, not a person's name, a state's name. Is it the voice of lack, of unworthiness, of fear, of resentment? Neville would call this identifying the state. Jung would call it making the complex conscious. The act is the same. You are separating yourself from the voice. You are recognizing that it is not I am speaking. It is a pattern, a habit, a belief system that has been running unchecked. The moment you name it, you begin to dethrone it. Because a tyrant that is seen is no longer invisible. And a belief that is named is no longer mistaken for reality. Step 3. Recognize the tyrant's origin. This is not psychoanalysis. You do not need to spend years excavating your childhood. But it is useful, briefly, to ask, where did this voice come from? Did it come from a parent who was afraid for you, and so taught you to expect disappointment? Did it come from a teacher who told you that you were not smart enough, not talented enough, not enough? Did it come from a wound, a betrayal, a loss, a failure, that hardened into a law? You are not looking for someone to blame. You are looking for clarity. Because the tyrant always pretends to be the voice of reality. And once you see that it is not reality, that it is a learned belief, a defensive strategy, an old story, it loses its hold on you. Step 4. Replace the conversation. This is where Neville's teaching becomes precise and practical. You do not fight the tyrant. You do not argue with it. You do not try to convince it that it is wrong. You simply stop feeding it. You withdraw your attention, your belief, your emotional investment, and you begin a new conversation. You assume a new state. If the tyrant says, "I am not wanted," you begin to say, "I am desired, I am chosen, I am cherished." If the tyrant says, "I am powerless," you say, "I am sovereign, I create my world, I am." If the tyrant says, "I am a failure," you say, "I am fulfillment, I am abundance, I am the operant power." This is not affirmation in the shallow sense. This is assumption. You are claiming a new identity. You are speaking from the state you wish to occupy, not the state you are trying to escape. And here is the key. You persist in this conversation. You saturate your inner speech with it. You do not wait for the outer world to confirm it before you believe it. You believe it first. You assume it as true. And then, inevitably, the outer world conforms. Neville said, "Assume it and walk in the assumption, and the assumption, though at the moment denied by your senses, will harden into fact." The tyrant ruled you through repetition. It said the same thing over and over until you accepted it as truth. You reclaim your throne the same way, through repetition of a new assumption, until it becomes the dominant conversation, the dominant state, the dominant reality. Step 5. Use revision to heal the past. If there is a memory that the tyrant uses against you, a moment of shame, of failure, of rejection, revise it. Neville taught that you can go back into memory and reimagine it, not to deny what happened, but to rewrite the meaning you gave it, to rob it of its power. If the memory says, "You were humiliated," revise it so that you see yourself dignified, confident, unshaken. If the memory says, "You were abandoned," revise it so that you see yourself surrounded by love, by presence, by care. You are not changing history. You are changing the story you have been telling about history. And that story is what has been creating your present. Jung would say, you are integrating the shadow, reclaiming the energy that was locked in the wound. Neville would say, you are entering a new state, rewriting the inner conversation that has been dictating your outer experience. Both are true. And both are acts of sovereignty. Step back with me for a moment. What does it tell us that Neville Goddard, working as a mystic and teacher of scripture, and Carl Jung, working as a psychologist and explorer of the unconscious, arrived at the same insight? That the enemy is never outside. That you are never fighting a person, a circumstance, a fate. You are always only fighting a belief. And that belief is a tyrant, a shadow, a false authority that rules you only because you have not yet claimed your own. This is not a coincidence. This is not two men stumbling onto the same metaphor. This is the recognition of a fundamental truth about consciousness, about the human being, about the nature of reality itself. Consciousness is the only reality, and within consciousness there is only one true authority, I am. Everything else, every fear, every limitation, every story of unworthiness, is content within consciousness. It is not the ground. It is the weather. And you are not the weather. You are the sky. Neville knew this because he had read scripture as a psychological map. He had seen that the stories of kings and tyrants, of exile and return, of slavery and liberation, were not historical accounts. They were descriptions of states of consciousness. Pharaoh is not a man in Egypt. Pharaoh is the tyrant in your own mind. And Moses is not a liberator in history. Moses is the I am waking up to its own power. Jung knew this because he had worked with patients who were haunted by their own projections, their own complexes, their own shadows. He had seen that healing came not from changing the world, but from changing the relationship to the inner world, from making the unconscious conscious, from reclaiming what had been disowned. And both men, in their own language, said the same thing. You are not a victim of your psyche. You are the creative principle within it. This is why shadow work and inner conversation are not separate practices. They are two expressions of the same work, the work of sovereignty, the work of self-authorship, the work of ending the reign of a false ruler and claiming the throne that was always yours. When you do this work, when you name the tyrant, when you bring the shadow into the light, when you change the inner conversation, you are not just improving your life. You are aligning with a truth that every mystical tradition has known, that the divine is not outside you, waiting to be petitioned. The divine is you, waiting to be recognized. I am is the name of God, and it is your name. The tyrant is anything that makes you forget this. Anything that tells you that you are small, powerless, unworthy, at the mercy of forces beyond your control. And the practice, whether you call it shadow work or assumption or revision or entering the Sabbath, is the act of remembering. You are not here to be ruled. You are here to rule, not in domination, but in sovereignty, in conscious creation, in the full flowering of the I Am. You clicked on a thumbnail that said, "Kill your tyrant," and now you know what that means. It means identifying the voice in your mind that has been speaking as if it were you, but is not you. It means recognizing it as a belief, not a truth, a state, not a fate, a pattern you can step out of the moment you see it clearly. It means withdrawing your authority from that voice and placing it where it belongs, on the I Am, on the consciousness that is the only reality, on the creative principle that has always been you, beneath every mask, every wound, every false identity. Neville said it plainly. You are told to die daily, die to the old conversations, die to the old assumptions, be reborn in the new. And Jung, in his own way, said the same. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The tyrant is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It has shown you, through suffering, through limitation, through the endless repetition of unwanted patterns, that you were never meant to live this way. That there is another conversation available, another state, another throne. If this exploration has meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like or subscribe to this channel. It keeps this work alive, and it tells me there are others out there ready for this deeper conversation. I honor every mind that walks this path with us. Take what we've explored here and make it yours, not as theory, as practice. Tonight, when you lie down to sleep, listen to the inner conversation, notice the tyrant's voice, and then, gently, firmly replace it. Assume the state you wish to occupy. Speak from I Am, and do it again tomorrow, and the day after, until the new conversation becomes the dominant one. Until the tyrant is not killed, but simply forgotten, because you have remembered who you are. The world is yourself pushed out, and you have been imagining from limitation long enough. Assume your freedom. Assume your wholeness. Assume the state of the wish fulfilled, and let the outer world catch up to what you have already claimed within. Neville said, "Dare to assume it." And I say the same. Dare to believe that you are not subject to anything, not to circumstance, not to history, not to the voice that has ruled you from the shadows. You are consciousness. You are I Am, and everything else is just weather passing through the sky that you are.